sitting on my doorstep, the people's passing by. They're coming back from getting wrecked. Everybody's high. Saturday night, what a bitch, laying on the lawn. The morning comes to bring the switch after the buzz is gone.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Addictions, the podcast about addictions. I'm your host, David Wagner. Today on the show we are speaking with Greg Cunningham. Now, Greg actually served as a police officer in a narcotics unit for roughly 14 years, so he brings a very different perspective to this whole addiction thing. And I thought it would be a great idea to interview Greg on the show. He also hosts a page on Facebook and Twitter called Let's Try a Different Way, in which he posts articles about the war on drugs and how it has just simply miserably failed us. And it was really a big mistake, in my opinion, at least. The amount of money that we have put into the war on drugs over the past 50, 60 years is just unreal. It's staggering. And if you do the research and take a look, it will blow your mind. You know, before we get to the interview, though, I do want to remind everyone that you can find all of the episodes on our website at addictionspodcast.com. From there, you can find links to resources to getting help with addiction. You can find links to all of the episodes of the show this far, and you can also find links to support the show if you enjoy the show and would like to help us out. But without further ado, let's get Greg on the line, and let's get right into the thick of this conversation. Today on the Addictions Podcast, we are speaking with Greg Cunningham. Now, Greg, he has an extensive background when it comes to addiction, and he's actually had some things published regarding addiction and, you know, the war on drugs and things like that. And I thought this would be a fantastic topic for us to talk about on the podcast. So I've invited Greg to come on the show and kind of fill us in on some of the stuff he knows. Then we're going to talk about some statistics about the war on drugs. Now, Greg, why don't you kind of clue our listeners into what you've been up to these days and how addiction has affected you in the past, whether it's on a personal level or whatever.
Yeah, it's pretty personal. Just a little background. I was a police officer for 14 years. I worked narcotics most of my career.
Yeah.
During that time as a police officer, I got injured a few times, and each time, of course, you know, went to the doctor and got on some kind of painkiller. And injury after injury, you know, it started becoming a string of narcotics where, you know, I just couldn't get off of them. But before I knew it, I was addicted.
Yeah.
Of course, at that time, I worked in narcotics most of my career, so I was able to talk myself out of believing that I was an addict for quite some time.
You've actually seen, you know, kind of both sides of the spectrum. I mean, from the law enforcement perspective to the actual, you know, being affected by addiction yourself. So I think that gives you a unique perspective on things, you know?
Yeah. The funny thing is my perspective on law enforcement and drugs hasn't changed that much.
Yeah.
Even when I was working narcotics, I was more worried about helping the people than I was about throwing users in jail. Now, meth cooks and so on and so forth, I didn't have that much sympathy for.
Yeah, yeah.
But the normal, average, everyday Joe, yeah, you know, I tried to do what was right instead of, you know, what was easiest. Anyway, after I got addicted, well, the problem I have there is, you know, who does a cop go to ask for help? It's pretty much any time you get the label of addict thrown on you, my career's over, my family's probably gone, so on and so forth.
Yeah.
So I suffered through it for several more years, and finally managed to get clean for a few years. And then I had left the police department before I got in any trouble. I didn't want to be, you know, another statistic of another cop getting arrested on, you know, while he's still a police officer. I just didn't want that.
Yeah, exactly.
So I resigned, eventually got clean, got sent to a rehab program that was really kind of a joke, but I did manage to stay off it for a few years. Well, after being clean for a few years, I went to work for a company that does firearms training for police and military units all over the world. And during that time, I got hurt. Well, I'd been clean for several years, so I thought I had this thing licked. And so, the doctor put me on pain medicine. I'd actually hurt my back. And it just started all over again, right back like I'd never left it. My family life started to fail, so on and so forth. So I got to where I just didn't care. And, I was taking a lot of pills every single day. So, my family left. I ended up quitting my job and finally got caught up with by law enforcement for going to multiple doctors. Anyway, went to court, went through that whole process and, still ended up not getting a felony conviction on my record, but, close enough that I certainly don't want to go through that again.
Yeah.
And so I did all the court stuff required, such as going to the 12-step programs and so on and so forth. Through that, both through my law enforcement career and through my addiction career, I have met a lot of addicts. And I am thoroughly convinced that the way that our country and most of the world is attacking the addiction issue is wrong. That this isn't going to work. It's never going to work. And that the drug war has failed, and it failed a long time ago.
Yeah, I agree completely. And I can relate, not so much from the law enforcement kind of side of things, because, obviously I'm not in law enforcement, but I'd get clean for a little while and think I was out of the woods, and then one thing or another would happen, and, I relapsed more times than I can really remember, to be honest with you, until I found opioid replacement therapies like Suboxone. And I tried methadone, but the thing with methadone is I can abuse that and get high still. Whereas with Suboxone, once I get to a certain maintenance dose, I'm no longer feeling that euphoric feeling, and for me, that was the ticket. That's what really helped me. Now, as far as your rehab stuff goes, which kind of route did you take there?
I went to a program called First Step.
Okay.
And basically, it's just a work camp. So what they do is they told me it was the toughest program in the state, which is why I wanted to go to it.
Yeah, hell yeah.
I wanted off this stuff. And so what it turned out that you really did is you stayed on this campus, and every morning at 5 a.m., they woke you up, they fed you breakfast, and then you piled into these vans that were held together with chewing gum and duct tape and baling wire. They really... Being a police officer, those things wouldn't have passed inspection any day of the week.
Yeah.
And they would shove all these people into the van, and then they would drop you off at these various places where people had paid or businesses had paid, either one, to have a laborer there. So you would work at that particular place until usually 5. Then the van would come back around, pick you up. You'd come back, you'd have dinner. And then they'd have an impromptu NA meeting afterwards that everyone had to attend. So that was pretty much Monday through Friday. And then once you'd been on campus for, I think, 3 months, then they would allow you to go to off-campus meetings, but they drove you.
Yeah.
So they would take a bunch of people that had been there longer than 3 months, and they'd take them to other NA meetings around town. But that's all it was. And, of course, you were subject to, drug testing and so on and so forth. But other than that, it was nothing else. It was just like going to an NA meeting every day and then working for free because you didn't make any of that money. All that money went back to First Step.
Yeah, yeah.
So I saw a lot of people fail and a lot of people give up and so on and so forth. But, I've been lucky in that when it comes to me getting clean, when I can get clean, if I can stay clean for a few months, I'm okay. Yeah. My problem comes to if I ever take another pill. I don't sit around the house and dream about narcotics, getting pills and so on and so forth. And I'm not saying I'm better than anyone either. It's just not my MO.
Yeah, yeah.
If I go into the doctor and he gives me a prescription of narcotics and I take it, then I'm jumping right back in the deep end and drowning again. And, I've recently had to have some medical procedures that really worried me, but luckily I made it through those without any narcotics. So yeah, it's been a difficult time.
Yeah, for sure.
At one time when I was an addict and still working at the police department, I had looked at the methadone way and there's no way that, the police department's going to allow you to work on duty with a gun driving 100 miles an hour on methadone.
Exactly. No.
And Suboxone, I don't even think was being offered back then. And then I've been talking to another addict who's a doctor, and he had the same problem is he can't maintain his license and take any replacement therapy. So both of us have kind of, just had to go cold turkey.
I actually interviewed a guy on the show. He does another podcast, but his show actually it's called Rescue the Rescuer, and he interviews and talks with people who are in law enforcement, first responders, firefighters, people like this who have been through these. It's a high stress situation. It really is. And a lot of times, there's PTSD going on, there's addiction going on, and, a lot of people don't think that, these people that are in these positions like law enforcement or doctors even, or, firefighters, first responders, they don't realize that the stress that they go through can often, it can lead to unhealthy coping mechanisms like using drugs. And it's a really good show, and if you get a chance, check that out. It's
check it out.
Called Rescue the Rescuer. I think it's on iTunes. Great show.
I've already wrote it down. Speaking of that, that's kind of the problem, though, at least in law enforcement, is, and we're all guilty of it, is a very type A personality type of business. No one ever wants to admit that they need help, because that means you're weak.
Yeah, there's a certain stigma around it.
Right. And that's why you see so many officers, as alcoholics, drug addicts, sex addicts, so on and so forth, because none of them want to ask for help. And then when they find themselves in that position, then they really can't ask for help because they're going to lose, more than likely lose their job.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Now, as far as the war on drugs, I mean, when you look at the amount of money, that the government has spent on fighting this war on drugs.
Oh yeah,
it's staggering. I've heard upwards of $50 billion. I mean, then you add in all these nonviolent drug offenders who've been arrested. That puts a drag on the economy, on the taxpayers, on a lot of things, even for just petty stuff like marijuana. It's which, I mean, people do have problems with marijuana. It's a substance that alters your mind, and that's all there is to it. But when compared with heroin or methamphetamine, it's almost like ginger beer. I think that there's so many. It's a multifaceted problem, and it's almost paradoxical in a way, because rather than punishment, we need to move away from that and move more towards rehabilitation, which I think, the ball has begun rolling on that to a degree, but I think we need to invest much more money and time into that.
It certainly happened on the medical side, but it's not happening real fast on the government side.
Yeah, exactly.
From the research that I've done over the years, I find it funny. So you go back to prohibition of alcohol. We tried that for 13 years, and then we decided, that's not going to work because of all these problems. We created the mob, we created this, we created that. So the same guy that actually was working on prohibition, I'm sure you know who I'm talking about, then went and go, okay, well, we need to address drugs instead. And most of it's because, he was about to lose his job. But it's the same thing. If drugs were such a civilization-ending substance, they've only been outlawed for about 100 years, but yet drugs have been around pretty much since man walked the planet. So how did we get by that first 3 million years without cratering, since we didn't have any laws prior to that?
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Yeah, it doesn't make any sense. So we made it illegal, and the odd thing that I've seen statistically since we made it illegal is actually the number of addicts has climbed. Now, I don't know if that's directly attributed to it being outlawed, or if it's because we've made stronger and heavier doses of opiates. I think opiates are the big problem.
Yeah.
We've always had addicts, but it's never been to the strength that it is now. So generally about a third of the population is going to become an addict or an alcoholic no matter what you do. And when I say no matter what you do, I mean it, because, people are getting locked up for life in prison and they're still doing it. It's not stopping them.
No.
That's what people don't understand about addiction is when you're in that mode, there is no common sense to you. You were not thinking about that stuff. You were just thinking about when's my next dose.
Exactly. I can totally speak from experience there, you know.
Right.
Fortunately, I never got locked up. I mean, but I was prescribed opioids for 4.5 years by a doctor. Legitimately, I had a broken femur, and I still have chronic pain, but, you know, I've found other ways to deal with it, you know. And by doing this podcast, this really helps me stay vigilant and mindful of, you know, staying away from that sort of stuff. It's almost therapeutic for me. It is therapeutic for me to talk about it.
I still go to NA meetings, even though I don't like them very much.
Yeah.
It keeps it at the forefront of my mind.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important thing. You know, you've got to stay vigilant about your sobriety. But I mean, my main issue was opioids. You know, I mean, I drink from time to time. I use marijuana from time to time. But these are things that I can pick up and put down. I've never had, you know, any issues with. But it was the opioids that just, you know, the feeling that I got from them, the chemical hooks. But when I really boil it down and look at why I was using, it was because of a myriad of psychological issues that I was going through. I mean, initially I was using the drugs for pain because I was in a lot of pain, but within a short period of time, it was, you know, I was filling a void with the drugs.
And you're creating more problems for you while you're on them, too. So
exactly.
It just adds. That's the thing, though. I've read studies here recently saying, well, not even recently, I read one a couple years back, that basically say when it comes to opiates, it's not if you're an addict. It is how high of a dose and how long before you become one.
Exactly.
And I think the numbers kind of support that because, you know, the drug companies started pushing this real hard in the 80s and the 90s. You know, they had an army of drug reps coming out and going to every doctor saying, hey, this is a Schedule 3 now, not a Schedule 2.
Yeah.
So it's safer. And doctors bit that. And so they would shovel that stuff out like candy. And that's why we've ended up with the number of addicts that we have today.
Oh, and not only that, but, you know, I'm not going to name any names here, but I know very closely a few people who work in the medical community in administration, and you know, they say that when the drug reps come in, they often will cater meals for the entire office and,
right.
you know, bring in all kinds of swag, and it's almost like bribery. It just, you know, blows my mind, you know, and I think that's
it's the same thing lobbyists do on the Hill.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a big part of the problem.
Yeah, I mean, I remember, you know, during my addiction, because I had this strange morality that I would never buy drugs off the street or anything like that. So I got my drugs almost exclusively from doctors.
Yeah.
So I was in a lot of doctors' offices. And, you know, I would see the same drug rep in 3 different offices in the same day doing the same thing. And I remember having coupons for Vicodin. And once I learned that the Tylenol was bad for your liver, I decided to switch to Tussinex. So Tussinex has no Tylenol on it, and it's a time release. Well, then I got coupons for that, too. Now, who gives coupons for narcotics in hindsight?
Yeah.
I mean, that's insane.
With the liver damage from, you know, like hydrocodone with the Tylenol, like I was on Norco, and that was my hydrocodone was my drug of choice. It got to the point where I was taking so many pills a day, you know, 10 to 15 10 milligram pills with 325 milligrams of acetaminophen in them, that, you know, I was being stupid, but I was trying to be smart about being stupid. So I would do what's called the cold water extract, and I'm not going to explain how to do that on the air, but
I did it. You don't have to tell me.
Yeah, but, you know, it removes the Tylenol so that you're, you know, less prone to damaging your organs. But, you know, it gets to a point where it's enough is enough. Once I lost my insurance and my doctor booted me off as a patient because I had a problem, I soon realized that I'm spending 80% of my paycheck every week on drugs on the street.
Absolutely.
It just was not feasible. It had to come to an end.
Yeah, I totally empathize with where you're coming from. And that's one of you mentioned something there that drives me crazy is, you know, when a doctor figures out, oh, you're an addict, there's very little attempt at trying to help you. They're worried about the DEA coming after them.
Exactly. And 2 years into my 4.5-year prescription, I actually went to my doctor and I told her, I said, you know, I'm kind of concerned about physical dependence to these drugs. And she says, well, we can cross that bridge when we get there. We can treat that when we get there. But, I got to the point where I was calling my prescriptions in early because I was obviously running out. About the third time I did that, I get a letter in the mail from my doctor saying I'm no longer a patient. So what happened to treating it? I was just blown away.
It scares them. And that goes back to the drug war as well. It's not just addicts that are addressed there. It's also the doctors.
Yeah.
There are some doctors out there that are pill pushers. And as an addict, I found everyone in my area. And, those are my go-to people. But there's a lot of good doctors out there. And the problem that they have is, how do you tell an addict from somebody that's really in pain? And that's very, very difficult. And so there's some doctors out there that I don't know, feel sorry for people more than some other doctors. And so they prescribe, narcotics a little more often. But, as soon as you pop up on law enforcement radar, they're going up your backside with a flashlight. And that's just not worth it to the doctor. And so then they start cutting back on patients that really need it.
Exactly. I mean, I can't blame it all on the doctors. It's a multifaceted issue, like I said. And I feel like as society, we need to really attack this thing attack is kind of the wrong word. We need to take this thing on and usher in a new way of dealing with this.
The criminal justice system just isn't meant for this. And when you were talking about, you've heard billions, I would say that's shockingly low. I would think it'd be more in the trillions.
Yeah.
People don't see all the money coming in from all the different ways. They look at, well, how much does a prison cost? How much does a cop cost? Now, how much does a jail cost? And they add that together. Well, that's not true at all. Eisenhower warned us about the industrial military complex. He just didn't see far enough in the future and see that there was going to be a criminal justice industrial complex. There is an entire economy built on criminal justice.
Oh, yeah, yeah. You look at the privatization of prisons and...
Oh, my Lord. That's the dumbest idea I've ever seen.
Yeah, and I can vouch for that. I have a couple of different uncles and some other family members who are involved in corrections, and they see this stuff every day.
There is nothing wrong with prisons, but when you look at our numbers, the last I checked, it was over 70% of the people in jail are in there for drug crimes.
Yeah.
Now, I'll back off that a little bit in that not all those are just addicts. Some of those are, bad people.
Yeah, of course.
Like I ran into a guy at an NA meeting the other day, and I asked him if I could talk about him. He said, yeah, sure. And he's been in prison a couple of times. Every time he went to prison, it was for a non-violent but non-drug crime. But the whole time he was hooked on some kind of substance. And he said that, he asked the judge, he asked his lawyer, and he asked the DA for treatment, not just to get out of prison. He was willing to go serve the time, but he wanted to go in and have a treatment program.
Yeah.
And because he's never been charged with a drug crime, they wouldn't give it to him.
Wow, that's astounding.
Now, what happens to an addict? They get pulled over for a traffic stop, and they find, some substance in the car. So they get arrested for that, and then they go get put in jail. And then it used to be that bond was based off of how much you could afford, basically. Yeah. How much money would hurt you to leave. It's not that way anymore. They're pretty much flat numbers, and they don't care if you're a millionaire or if you're broke. And so there's a lot of people that can't afford to pay bond, so they sit in jail. Well, at the same time, the jail is now charging them anywhere from $25 to $50 a day to sit in jail.
Yeah.
So every day that they're sitting in jail, they're getting charged. Then what the DAs like to do is they don't like to lose, so they want to plea everything. Because if they don't take it to trial, there's less chance of them losing. So what they do is they postpone your case over and over and over again, waiting to wear you down. Because believe me, ask some people that have been in prison, and I bet they'll tell you they'd rather be in prison than jail. So they wear you down, hoping that you'll finally get tired of being in jail and plead to whatever they'll give you.
Yeah, exactly.
So you plea bargain. So you end up with a suspended sentence, let's say. You're not going to prison, but you are a convicted felon. Well, now you've got to pay the court costs. You've got to pay all these little fees or things that have nothing to do with criminal justice. Then you also have to pay your lawyer. You also have to pay your probation officer now. You're going to have to pay him every month, plus the fine.
Yeah.
When I was working narcotics, methamphetamines were bad.
Yeah.
And we actually had the Oklahoma State Tax Commission also did the same thing. So they would charge you for having drugs without paying the state. And so in order to do that, they had to create some way that you could pay the state. So they came out with these tax stamps for every drug you can think of. And if that wasn't on your product, then you could also be charged for failure to pay taxes to the state. Every jurisdiction tries to drain you and charge you with as much as possible. It's not unusual. Don't get me wrong. I'm not against law enforcement. I'm not into the criminal justice system at all. But I do think, we're spending billions of dollars on locking addicts up, where we just barely even have scratched the surface of what causes addiction.
Exactly.
So this drives me nuts when I talk to politicians where they say, I ask them, how do you think we should handle, the addiction problem? And they're like, well, I'm all for, and I love this. I just talked to somebody that's running for governor in my state the other day, and this is his response. Well, I'm all for the legalization of marijuana, and I want to put more money into rehab. Now, both of those things bother me because, one, I don't care about marijuana. I'm talking about addiction all the way around. I don't care what the substance is.
Yeah.
The other thing is, I think we're putting the cart before the horse, because if we just barely understand the mechanics and the biology of addiction, why are we sticking people in treatment centers?
Yeah.
To me, it feels like we're treating addicts like we treated lepers. Back in the 1600s, we didn't know what caused leprosy. So we basically locked them up, put them away where they couldn't get to anybody. Then as time went on, and people went, oh, well, it's not their fault, so let's put them in colonies. So they take them and they put the lepers in the colonies, but still not helping them.
Yeah.
They're just grouping them all together. And then finally some doctors went, you know what, this looks like a medical problem. And so they start looking at it, and before you know it, they come out with treatments and cures. And I really feel like addiction is the same way. Instead of locking people up, because all you're doing is throwing really good people. There are a ton of people that I have met, both as a cop and as an addict, that outside of the narcotics are great people. They're smart people. They're kind. They're caring. They're wonderful people. But yet, they got a charge for, possession of opiates without a prescription or something like that. And so that's not only has it ruined their entire life, but, when they're on that substance, they do bad things. But that's not them. That's them on a substance. When they're not on that substance, they're great people. So we are literally throwing these people away. So if I take this person and I throw him into a treatment center, to me, that's like throwing somebody with leprosy into a leper colony. Hey, we're going to try and treat you here, but we have no idea what we're doing, so we don't know if it's going to work at all.
Yeah, and I've spoke with people who have been through rehab and said that, some of these rehab centers are the best place to score drugs.
Oh, yeah.
It just seems
For the captured audience.
counterintuitive, We could be investing so much of that money that we're investing in punishment into research and, figuring this thing out rather than throwing these people in jail and throwing away the key.
Exactly. When I was looking at comparing numbers, we did more research in 1 year to research car crashes that only like 30,000 people died in than we spent on addiction and opiate abuse when like hundreds of thousands of people were dying from it. And that makes no sense to me. It's just throwing money away.
Yeah. I think I read a statistic the other day that, like almost 100 some odd people a week or a day or something are dying from overdose. It's the leading cause of death.
It's even lowering our life expectancy overall.
Definitely. I often think how many years I've shaved off my life by all of the drug abuse that I've partaked in.
Well, that's kind of the funny thing. My father was a police officer as well, and he became an alcoholic. And so I'd always been told all my life, hey, watch the alcohol. And so I really did. I was really concerned about the alcohol. And so I had no problems until I took that first pill. And then from then on, it was over. But then again, is it genetic? Is it not? These are the questions. If we took a quarter of the money, the total money that is spent on locking addicts up, and actually put that into research, I guarantee you that it would be 10 times more than what's being put in there now. And if it's a brain problem, I don't know, maybe if it's a gene problem, maybe we can come up with a gene therapy to actually cure the problem. My concern is I have a son. Now, I look at my dad, he was an alcoholic, and from what I understand, his dad was an alcoholic. So I'm seriously concerned about my son, and I don't want my son to be treated like a criminal.
Exactly.
I was not a criminal because I became an addict or because I found out I was an addict or however you want to phrase it. That is a medical condition. That's like throwing somebody with cancer in prison because they smoked cigarettes or because they handled the wrong substance, whatever. It's ridiculous. And so what scares me is that, I'm older, so I'm okay with where I'm at. But when my son gets older, what if he gets hurt and he finds out the same thing that I did the wrong way? I just don't want him to suffer like that.
Yeah, I too have an 11-year-old daughter, and I would put off responsibilities so I could buy drugs, and that was for me the big eye opener was that, this is taking away from my daughter, and it was just a huge eye opener, and that's what really pushed me to want to get clean. But the thing is, I live in a rural area, and there's one doctor in the entire county that does a Suboxone program, and she's only allowed to have a certain number of patients each month. So I go in and I try to get into the program. I'm turned away because she's fully booked. But she says, call every month, and maybe we can get you in. I called every month for 7 months straight. Couldn't get in. So finally, I did a little research, and I took the COWS test, the Clinical Opioid Withdrawal Scale test. And, I made sure that I scored properly to be induced into a Suboxone program. And I said, well, I can't get Suboxone from the doctors, but I do know a lot of heroin addicts who use Suboxone in between being able to get their heroin fix. And they would often sell their Suboxone. So I bought Suboxone on the street. I induced myself. I took a little bit at a time until I reached the point where my withdrawals were at bay, and that was my starting dose for about 3 or 4 months. Over time, I did my own taper. I was not in any sort of program. I tapered down and got to the point where I was at like 0.25 milligrams of Suboxone, which is a tiny amount. Did that for about a month, and then I jumped, and I had a couple of days where the withdrawal was not the greatest, but it wasn't the worst. I made it through. But the lack of resources is another problem for people that genuinely want to quit.
Sure. And that's something that we can take care of right now.
Yeah. Oh, definitely. And another thing is the state of mental health care in this country. It's lackluster, to say the least.
It's fairly non-existent.
Yeah.
I had to deal with, we called them Signal 8. They were people with mental defects, however you want to put it.
Yeah.
And as an officer, the only thing we could ever do with them is, they're not hurting anybody. There's nothing we could do with them.
Yeah.
If they were threatening to harm themselves or others, well, then we could take them to the crisis center, and they would keep them for 72 hours, and then they'd kick them right back out again.
Yeah.
Well, how is that helping anything?
Exactly.
They would try, if they were on meds, they would try and help them get back on their meds, so on and so forth. But, these people, aren't mentally right. How are you going to count on that person to go get their medication and actually take it? It's mind-blowingly dumb. And then they wonder why, all these people with mental problems are getting shot. We're just not equipped to handle them. And so, they scare us, and, I feel like my life's in danger, and next thing you know, I've shot the guy. And that's not the way it should be.
Yeah.
But that is the way it is. But again,
we see that all too often.
Where's the money at, though?
Exactly. And we need to stop this focus on the profiting. Yeah, it's almost like a vicious downward spiral that we're kind of going into with this whole thing, and that's what really scares me. I almost feel like it's going to get worse before it gets better.
Well, even our own president the other day, they and I'm not going to get into the politics of it, of Trump or anything, but I am going to get into what he was talking about in regards to the opiate addiction problem. They gave him all this money, and the only idea that he's really come up with is, well, let's give the death penalty to people for drugs.
That is, that is insane.
There's that one, and then they had a memorial wall that's going to travel around the company, and that really upset me. I was like, you're using money. Here's the thing. I feel sorry for all the people that have died from opiate abuse and overdoses and all sorts of drugs, not just opiates. But the fact is, there's a lot more of them alive and suffering right now. So, we can use what happened to the ones that passed away as motivation to help the ones that are alive. Let's celebrate the people that have passed. Let's celebrate their life by helping somebody else keep alive. But instead, we're going to buy a memorial and pass it around the country. And that's just mind-blowing to me.
Yeah, you're letting those people die in vain.
Exactly. Great, you gave them a memorial, but now 100 more have died just today because you didn't spend $1 to try and get them, for instance, Suboxone treatment, or open up a medical research that actually could look into the physical aspects of addiction and how we can. It's insane. But we just keep throwing money into the criminal justice system for this problem. If you actually go and look at the statistics of the people in jail for violent crimes, nonviolent crimes, and drug crimes, if you got rid of all of the people in there for drug crimes, you could close down 2/3 of the prison in the country.
Oh, easily. Yeah.
The other problem is the money. I mean, you kind of hit on it a minute ago. So departments, they get grants from the federal government. So that's money coming into them that they can spend. Then, if they start a narcotics unit, which inevitably they will, they go out and they start seizing things. That's more money. In our state, it's an 80-20 split. So the 80% will go back to the police department, 20 will go to the DA's office. That's just a main line of more money coming in. And I promise you, if you see a narcotics unit that isn't doing seizures, they're not going to last long. They'll shut it down because it's not making them any money. Even if they're seizing, 50,000 pounds of dope every day, if there's no money coming in, it's going to close.
Yeah.
So they have that money coming in. And then, the DA's office, same deal. They get money from the federal government. They also get, the injection from the seizures and so on and so forth. And then they also get, stuff from the courts because that's part of the fees going to pay them. And so it really becomes all about money. And then you look at, okay, so I want to form a narcotics unit, but I still need so many patrolmen. So I need to hire 10 more officers. So I hired 10 more officers. That's 10 more full outfits, uniforms, and all the other garbage that goes with it for those 10 guys. Oh, and then you have these companies that are like GE that make everything under the sun for a police officer to use outside of what he normally needs to use. And so there's a saying in law enforcement, if you paint it black and put Velcro on it, cops will buy it. And there's a lot of truth to that. And so they'll come out with all these gadgets and things and say, hey, you need this to work narcotics, that to work narcotics, so on and so forth. And so the departments just buy more and more of that stuff. And so, you end up with this room full of toys that nobody's really using. That's what I was talking about with the criminal justice industrial complex, is you have all these companies on the peripheral that are opening up private prisons to make money, that are selling equipment to prisons, that are selling equipment to police departments, so on and so forth. And it's all about making money. And so if you cut the drug addicts out of that equation, that's a huge amount of money that all of these peripheral companies are going to lose. So they don't want to do that. The drug war is good for them because they're making money, the state's making money, the country's making money. It's all, about making that dollar. And, at the same time, we get to say, well, drug addicts rob people and kill people. I had this conversation with my girlfriend the other day, and we were talking about whether we should legalize all drugs or not. And I have mixed emotions about both those things. But one of the things I brought up about that was, well, if you decriminalize the possession of narcotics, that's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about stop throwing addicts in prison for being addicts. Well, what if they're driving a car and they hit a family of 10? Well, then you're not throwing them in jail for being an addict. You're throwing them in jail for driving under the influence of drugs, which is the same thing as driving under the influence of alcohol, which completely makes sense. If you decriminalize the substance and the person chooses to use that substance, that's one thing. It's another if he or she chooses to use that substance and then goes out and gets in their car and kills people. So I don't have any problem with that. That is a righteous prosecution. If they break into somebody's house and, rob them blind and murder them, you're not throwing them in jail for the addiction. You're throwing them in jail for the decisions that they made. But if you take the prohibition away from it, there's a lot less need for those acts because they are a lot more prevalent. They're not run by, drug kingpins. And, if we went to the doing away with prohibition altogether and you could get hydrocodone at your family grocery store, for instance, I guarantee you it would be hundreds of times more cheap than it is now, especially if you're buying it off the street. You know, what's a Loratab going for on the street now? 10 milligrams.
If it's 10 milligrams, it's $5-6 around here.
Exactly.
Per pill.
That's about what it is. So, you know, look at how much profit those guys are making.
Oh, yeah.
Well, how much did that pill actually cost? So you can see what I'm going to is if you eliminate trying to prosecute somebody for an illness, you're going to eliminate a lot of other problems that come about in the criminal justice system as well. And so we would no longer have this high prison population.
Yeah, you remove that black market. And, you know, with drug dealers, who knows, you know, exactly what you're getting. It could be spliced with fentanyl. Who knows? So it would be a safer alternative as well, health-wise. You know, I think you'd see a reduction in overdose deaths as well. But, you know, that's not to say that there aren't there's pros and there's cons to everything. But you've got to kind of weigh the two things and see what is the better route here to go.
Well, see, that's why I'm not out screaming that we need to legalize it or not, because that's not my concern. My concern is, what do we do to treat the people, period? What medical treatment can we give them that actually works, that there's scientific evidence that works? We can argue about the prohibition and the availability later. Let's start dealing with how are we going to stop treating addicts like criminals and start treating them like patients first is my thing. When I talked to one of the guys that's running for governor in my state, you know, he was like, well, we're a long ways off from decriminalization. And I was like, I'm not even talking about decriminalization. I'm talking about treating addicts like patients. And then on the flip side of that, you know, there are some bad people that use drugs too. And whether they're on drugs or off drugs, they're still going to do bad things. But those will also take care of themselves. They will end up in prison,
exactly,
you know, for other reasons. So in my case, I got in trouble for getting the drug I was addicted to. I didn't go rob somebody or, you know, carjack or, you know, stick a gun in anybody's face or do anything like that. I didn't even buy it off the street. I got in trouble for going to the doctor. In hindsight, that's silly, in my opinion. But it's part of the drug war. So this is how they're attacking it. Now, I'm not saying that I'm any different, but I know heroin addicts, they got to get their fix, and they can't go to a doctor to get it. They've got to get it from the black market. And you were right. Who knows what they're getting when they get it? And then what do they have to do to be able to get the money to get it? So we just keep doing this big roundy round in our criminal justice system here in this country. And, you know, I thought it was funny. I taught a class to police services in Indonesia. And Indonesia has the death penalty for anyone bringing drugs into the country. So you would think there's no drugs in that country.
Yeah.
There were 2 people in the hotel that I was staying in selling it. So, you know, the death penalty doesn't work. China had the death penalty for a long time for any opiate crime. And I think they might even still have it.
Yeah.
But it still doesn't stop at it. What that's going to stop is, I don't even say it's going to stop the weekend warriors. It's going to stop some of the weekend warriors. You know, the people that are just playing with it.
Yeah, exactly.
But, you know, this is something I used to argue when I taught classes to schools as well. And we talked about the different drugs and, you know, the effects of them. And, you know, every single slide, the last one was death. But when I got to marijuana, there was no death. Well, I got into a big argument with the principal of the school saying, you know, why come you don't have death on marijuana? It's like, because there's no justification for there are no reported cases of somebody dying directly from an overdose of marijuana. It doesn't happen.
No, it doesn't happen.
So that got us into the gateway drug thing. And my theory is, like, I used pills. I didn't use anything else. You know, I got prescriptions for Valium and all sorts of other different kinds of mind-altering drugs. I had no interest in those. If it wasn't hydrocodone or oxycodone, I didn't want it. So when they say marijuana is a gateway drug, the only way that I think it's a gateway drug is that it's against the law.
Yeah.
And so the person that wants to smoke weed or try smoking weed learns that it violates this law. And so they become numb to it. It's against the law for me to buy weed, but I do it every day. So if I want to try cocaine, it's no big deal. I'm just breaking the same law. And so they start to not fear the law as much because they've done it for so long on this one drug.
In my experiences with buying marijuana on the streets, you know, from a younger age, I'm 33 now, but you know, when I was 18 buying from my dealer, you know, a lot of times I'd go up there and I'd buy a quarter ounce of weed or whatever, you know, and every now and then the dealer would say, hey, I got some of this LSD, I got some of this cocaine, you want to try some of this, you know? And that's because if you could buy the marijuana in a non-black market situation, you would be less likely to be introduced into those other more hardcore drugs.
And you're already used to that type of behavior because you've been buying the weed for so long.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I have relatives that have smoked weed forever. One of them, I had twins actually, and he just put it down. And that's what I try to use him as an example of when I'm trying to tell people the difference between an addict and a heavy user.
Yeah.
And look, I'm an addict. If I take an oxycodone right now, it's very likely not going to be pretty for me. My relative, he smokes a joint every day of his life until he just decides to quit and he lays it down. And I can't. I cannot lay it down. Not by myself. I have to have help laying it down. You know, it takes family, it takes friends, it takes all of that to help me put it down. And that's the difference between an addict and a non-addict.
Speaking of that, now in your experience, have you seen, long-term marijuana users just stop cold turkey and, experience physical withdrawal on the level that opioids cause?
I have not.
Yeah. I've gotten into arguments with people over this that say, that marijuana causes major physical withdrawal, but I just don't see it.
I don't either. Everything that I've read and from what I've seen from personal experience does not indicate that marijuana causes some heavy-duty opiate-like withdrawal. It doesn't.
There may be some psychological kind of issues going on, but nothing incredibly physical.
Well, it's the same thing with methamphetamine. Methamphetamine is not a physical dependence. It's a psychological dependence.
Exactly.
And so methamphetamine, it's not going to send you into physical withdrawal like opiates do. It's just not the mechanics of the drug. And marijuana is the same way. It's a psychological dependence, not a physical. So if somebody tells me that somebody, fell down and went to Caesars and did the floppy chicken for 20 minutes on the floor because they didn't smoke a joint today, I'm calling BS.
Yeah.
I have another relative that's almost 70.
Yeah.
He smoked all his life and he quit off and on.
Yeah. But I think that over time, over the past 50, 75 years, that the cannabis and marijuana have gotten such a bad rap and bad press, and it's like the scapegoat that everybody wants to go to. But really, it's compared to these other substances, it's not even in the same echelon.
You also have to understand that there's something special going on with marijuana back 100 years ago that nobody thinks about. Back then, we started coming out with fibers like nylon.
Yeah.
And so the rope industry started lobbying the government really hard to outlaw hemp and marijuana.
Yeah.
They could sell their rope cheaper, right? And so, they added to the already existing problem of, anybody that uses drugs is a scumbag. The last couple podcasts you were talking about the shame thing. And like I showed you, my last article was on that. And that's exactly what I mean is uneducated people, and by uneducated, I mean about drugs and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
Not everything. But uneducated people tend to lump everybody together, and they don't understand that certain drugs are more devastating to a human than others, or have more effect, for a better term. Where marijuana is almost no difference than drinking alcohol. Actually, the alcohol is probably a little more harsh because it goes after your liver. But because it's a drug, and this is the Controlled Substance Act that Nixon came out with was just insane.
Yeah.
So marijuana is put as a Schedule I drug. And so it looked like, oh, my Lord, that's, a Schedule I. No way. That thing's harsh.
Yeah, and methamphetamine is a Schedule II, I believe.
Right. Methamphetamine was actually prescribed like mad back before the Controlled Substance Act.
Yep.
For weight loss. And now it's even prescribed for narcolepsy.
Yeah.
You can still obtain it by prescription. Heroin is almost no different than all the other opiates that we have. All of those are, on the scheduled list. Heroin's a Schedule I. I mean, that was the thing I was talking about earlier is when hydrocodone first came out, the Germans found it. Then it got to the U.S., I believe, in the 1950s. And then during that time, we did a study, and it was after we found out how addictive hydrocodone was on rats. They came out with the Controlled Substance Act, and so they put it in Schedule II. Well, the drug companies said, well, what if we mix it with something, with an adulterant? And they convinced the FDA and the government to go, okay, well, if you throw Tylenol in there, we'll make it a Schedule III instead of a Schedule II.
Really? Wow.
Even though they're not changing the addictiveness of the first substance. And I've heard stories. I haven't read anything evidence-wise. But I've heard stories that the whole idea behind the Tylenol was, well, nobody will overuse this because it's bad for your liver. Well, that's not true. I mean, we have addicts die every day from liver failure from that very thing. But that is how they got it down to a Schedule 3. And so, of course, once they got it to a Schedule 3, as I said earlier in the podcast, they went to the doctors and like, oh, these are all really strong drugs, but this Vicodin, it's a Schedule 3. So, it's not as addictive, because that's, if you look at how the schedules are, it's by how addictive it is and how likely it is to be abused. So if you look at a Schedule 2 and a Schedule 3 is supposed to be safer. That's what the doctors think. And whammo, we end up throwing them out like candy because it's not a Schedule 2.
Yeah. And that's what blows my mind, because I cannot fathom or understand one bit how methamphetamine can be less destructive than marijuana.
Absolutely. It has no rhyme or reason. It's like somebody threw a dart and said, well, it also has to do whether or not it has an accepted medical purpose. So this is why methamphetamine is actually a Schedule 2.
I see.
Marijuana, according to the schedule, has no accepted medical purpose. But now you see what's going on in the country. Now there's a doctor named Peter Grinspoon. He wrote a book called Free Refills.
Okay.
And he was a doctor that became addicted to his own supply as well. Well, his father was, I believe, a psychiatrist. And I guess his brother or his father's son had a type of cancer, and they started treating it basically illegally with marijuana, and he saw how much it helped his son. And so from that point on, Dr. Grinspoon's father, really started pushing the legalization of marijuana and the use, at least for medical purposes. And you can go on YouTube and find his dad on there, tons, talking about it. And it's not just him. There are doctors all over this country that are saying, yes, marijuana does help some people for this and some people for this. And so the only thing that's holding us back is they want to keep it a Schedule 1, which means you can't get it for legal research without jumping through all these stupid hoops, and so it makes it inaccessible.
To be perfectly honest with you, when I was using my hydrocodone for my legitimate pain, it didn't exactly take the pain away. It just put my mind into a state where the pain was tolerable. And I find I do have a medical marijuana card, but I do find, my pain is neuropathic. I broke my left femur, so I have a lot of nerve pain. And I found for that nerve pain that using medical marijuana, it actually, I'm not sure if it's all in my mind or what, because I haven't done the research on it, but, I can honestly say that I get more relief from, whether it's edibles or smoking it for my nerve pain than I did from any of the narcotics that I used, any of the opioids.
I'm not going to go into the whole long story, but I ran into an older couple that had like 2 pounds of marijuana in their crisper in their refrigerator.
Yeah.
And then there were these pill bottles everywhere, and most of them had pills in them. And so I get to talking to this couple, and both of them were saying, well, we smoke the weed because the pills don't work. That's why the pill bottles and the pills are all over the place, because they're not taking them. Yeah. So they're replacing their pain medicine with the marijuana. Now, not a big marijuana guy here. I really could care less.
Yeah.
If it works, great. If it doesn't, whatever. I'm withholding judgment again until science comes and tells me, no, it really does do this.
The one thing I'll say about marijuana is that if you're smoking it, anytime you're inhaling burnt plant material into your lungs, it's
not great.
It's not good for you. But there are other delivery systems for it, and it doesn't even necessarily have to get you high. There are several other cannabinoids in the plant itself that are really not psychoactive in nature, but they do hold some of these medical properties. Don't get me wrong, I do enjoy the high from the marijuana, but it's nothing that I am chemically hooked into. I mean, I can go days and days and days without it, and my skeleton isn't trying to jump out of my body like it was when I was on opioids.
Right. There are several people. My girlfriend is politically the polar opposite of me.
Yeah.
Pretty conservative. But even she finds some benefit. Oklahoma CBD oil is legal.
Yeah.
Marijuana's not, but CBD oil. And she uses it. Other people in her family do. And, they find that it works. And, it has no psychoactive component to it. So it's not because she's getting high. Because it apparently works. I even sent some to my mother because she has nerve pain as well.
Yeah.
And I haven't heard the end results back from that. But look, there are hundreds and thousands and millions of probably compounds out there that we don't even know exist. And since we haven't tested marijuana, how in the heck can we say it has no accepted medical purpose?
Exactly.
That's literally putting the cart before the horse. You're saying, no, this isn't good for us. We don't know why, but it is. It's bad.
Well, I think that stems from, decades and decades and decades of that negative stigma surrounding marijuana.
It's drugs, period.
Yeah, drugs in general,
They lump them all in together.
We've been kind of brainwashed, might not be the correct word, but we've been kind of duped into thinking that, if you're on drugs, you're an immoral person, and this is bad.
What's kind of funny about that is I remember back in the 80s and early 90s, there were all sorts of people that were strung out on Valium.
Yeah.
But somehow people thought of them as better because they were getting their stuff in a prescription from a doctor. But yet they're just as big a junkie as anybody else. Take their pills away, they might die. And it was okay back then. But now that stigmatism has been attached to them, now it's not okay to be addicted to anything. Well, it's not okay to be addicted to anything, but it's not wrong either. It's like cancer. It's not okay to have cancer, but it's not illegal. It's not wrong. There's no moral problem with you. There's no, innate problem of you can't be trusted and you're going to kill people and rip people off. That's a farce. And that's what addicts have been labeled now. And it's partially because that's what agenda a lot of people have pushed. I'm not just laying at the feet of our government. Drug companies have done it. Media has done it. Whenever you saw a junkie on TV, not a junkie, but whenever you saw somebody that was doing something wrong, they were typically a junkie. And then, especially back in the 80s and 90s, in the crack epidemic, the bad guy was always a black male crackhead.
Yeah.
Couldn't just be a black male or a white male. No, it had to be a black male crackhead. So they had to combine the two so they're scarier. Nowadays, it's anybody that uses drugs, and they're all bad.
Exactly, and they did that back in like the 1920s with the whole jazz scene. All these black musicians, they're all using marijuana, and they're all stay away from these people, and it was just it was wrong.
Oh, and then the Reaper Madness. I don't know if you've ever seen that movie, but
yeah.
That was the beginning of the campaign against marijuana and drugs in general.
Yeah.
Trying to stigmatize what happens. And like I said, if addiction was such a societal ending problem, then how did we make it the first 300,000 years? That makes no sense.
That's a fantastic point. It really is. One thing I do want to ask is, what is the biggest thing that we can do as society to correct this problem, in your opinion?
First thing I would like to see that I think would help, but I think it's also kind of a dream, is that anybody and everybody that has found themselves with a substance abuse problem. I don't even like using the word addict. And the only reason I use it now talking to you is because it is a term that everybody understands.
Yeah.
But anybody that has a substance use disorder, is what I prefer, would come out and stop hiding. I hate to compare it to being gay, but it's kind of the same thing.
Yeah.
A lot of the people that have had these addictive problems are in the closet because they know if they come out, their coworkers, their future employers, all of that is going to be in jeopardy.
Exactly.
But it's going to take more people coming out so people can see that, no, the majority of addicts are not, living under a bridge, stealing your car. They're your neighbor, they're your brother, they're your daughter, they're your son. They're people that you know and care for. And, when they are not in active addiction, when they are, as I put it, in remission, they're great, they're fabulous people. You love them to death.
Yeah.
That's who the addicts are. And until people start to recognize that addicts are not that guy underneath the bridge, that they are those people, I don't see much hope. The only other thing is, what I do now as well is I call my congressman, I write my congressman. We have a governor race this year, and so I have contacted everyone that's running for governor and talked to them about it. Because we do need to start changing the laws we need to decriminalize at least being an addict. But until that gets more mainstream, all they're going to want to do is just keep on doing what they've been doing, which is just lock them up. And, because when they're locked up, you don't see them until they get back out of jail again. And, the awful thing about that is they go into jail with an addiction. They go to prison with an addiction. They stay in prison with addiction because there's just as much dope in there as there is out here. And then they come right back out, can't get a job, so they turn to a life of crime and more drug use. And it's just one big vicious circle. So, until we can stop that repetitiveness, we're going to have a hard time.
Yeah.
They talk about education. I guess what I think of education is, what is an addict really? They're not the guy under the bridge. The vast majority of them are normal, everyday people. And until our society realizes that and stops thinking that they're scummy people that are criminals, we're going to have a hard time changing the government's mind, because it's going to take more than just the addicts griping at the senators and the governors and so on and so forth to change those laws. It's going to take quote unquote normal people. What's mind blowing to me is, with all the opiate abuse that we have going on, how many families? I mean, you would think by now the vast majority of the families in the country would have been affected by this opiate addiction, but yet it still stays under wraps. Nobody wants to admit to being an addict. And like at the beginning of this, you asked me if it was okay to say my name. And the reason I said yes is because I want people to know that, I have a substance abuse problem. I have the disorder, and I'm not a bad person. I was a police officer. I probably saved, so-and-so's butt, that I walked into last week, at some point, or, drug somebody out of a house that was burning, because I literally have done that, or even CPR to that person. So you had somebody that is quote unquote an addict helping people every single day and putting their life on the line. Yeah. And I want people to know that.
One last thing that I'd like to ask you, Greg, before we kind of wrap things up is, if there's anybody listening right now that's in the depths of addiction and just struggling and doesn't know where to turn, what would be the best advice that you could give them?
What I've seen that works, if you have a family, tell them. Tell your mother, tell your father, tell your wife. Don't just keep it to yourself. As far as treatment programs and how to get off of it, I can't recommend, because I've seen different things work for different people and other things, those same things fail for other people. So I can't direct anybody to go to NA or go to this treatment program. But I do know, especially in my case, that sharing with my family helped me more than anything else. Once my family was aware of what was going on, it made it easier to stop using.
For me, that was the biggest one too. Once I admitted to not only myself, but my mom and dad, and my intermediate family, it made it a lot easier to talk about, which in turn became therapeutic for me, which in turn led me to get the help that I needed. Now, I was a little unconventional in the way I went about getting help, but, here I am 1 year clean, and, I'm happier than I've been in the past decade. I don't like to give healthcare or medical advice on the show, because that's not what the show's all about. You're not the only person who has said this. This seems to be a running thing, and I would agree that the biggest, best thing you can do is to reach out to people that care about you.
And the odd thing about it, it's both good and bad, is you'll find out who really cares about you too.
Yes, you will. You'll find your true friends.
Absolutely. I had friends that I thought were really close until it was all of a sudden I'm an addict. My mother, I can't say enough about her. I mean, I have done some horrible things when I was under the influence, and she has stood by me through thick and thin, and so has my aunt. My family has helped me immensely, and I'm sure most others would too. If you don't have a family, then I would say, go to a friend that cares about you, or a husband or a wife.
Exactly.
But opening up to somebody that cares about you, I think, is the most important thing.
Yep. And there are, even if you can't find a person who you can do that with, even online, like on Facebook, I'm a member of numerous addiction support groups, and there are many people, they might be complete strangers, but they are there and willing to talk to you about it. And even that. And
you can always go to, you're right, and you can always go to an NA meeting too. Those people are the same as online. They understand what you're going through.
Exactly. I think that's fantastic advice. I cannot thank you enough for coming on the Addictions podcast.
I appreciate it, and I had a blast. I had a good time, and I'm more than happy to help out any way I can.
Thank you again. Once again, I'd like to thank Greg for coming on the show and sharing his story. For me, it was incredibly insightful. I mean, I knew a lot about the war on drugs, but definitely not to the extent that Greg could explain things, so I thought that was really amazing. Greg actually hosts a Facebook page called Let's Try a Different Way, and you can find it at facebook.com/LTADW. Again, that's facebook.com/LTADW. And he posts a lot of articles that are incredibly related to what we've been talking about on this episode. So if you're into that kind of thing, head on over there and like that page. Once again, I want to thank you all for listening. I can't thank you guys enough. So, yeah, thank you. And remember, never quit quitting.
You spent your money freely, then you smashed your only car. You aren't what you are really. You missed it by so damn far. Your head feels like it's in a blender, and you hate to see the dawn. Your stomach says return to sender after the buzz is gone. And Sundays you prayed Uncle John. You poisoned yourself last night. Mary slapped your friend Tom. You got in a hell of a fight. Monday comes and it's back to work. The week seems so damn long. The weekend's past, you're still a jerk after the buzz is gone.